The continued story of Terran, the assistant pig keeper. I'm glad you stayed to listen. Now sit round, as Papa Bear reads a story. Chapter 17. The Fledgling. The Gwythaint hung like a crumpled black rag, one wing upraised, the other folded awkwardly on its breast. No larger than a raven, it was young, and barely out of its first molt. The head seemed a little too big for its body, the feathers thin and quilly. As Terran cautiously approached, the Gwythaint fluttered vainly. Unable to free itself, the bird opened its curved beak and hissed warningly, but its eyes were dull and half closed. The companions followed Terran. As Gurgi saw what it was, he hunched up his shoulders, and with many fearful glances behind him, turned and crept off to a safe distance. Melangar whinnied nervously. The white pig, undisturbed, sat on her haunches, and looked cheerfully. Fluter, on seeing the bird, gave a low whistle. "It's a stroke of luck the parents aren't about," he said. "Those creatures will tear a man to shreds if their young are in danger." "It reminds me of Akron," Eloise said, "especially around the eyes, on days when she was in a bad temper." Dolly pulled out his axe from his belt. "What are you going to do?" Terran asked. The dwarf looked at him with surprise. "Going to do? Do you have any other stupid questions? You can't imagine I just let it sit there, can you? I'm going to chop off its head to begin with." "No!" cried Terran, seizing the dwarf's arm. "It's badly hurt." "Be glad of that," snapped Dolly. If it weren't, neither you nor I nor any of us would be standing here." "I will not have it killed," Terran declared. "It's in pain, and it needs help." "That's true," Eloise said. "It doesn't look comfortable at all. For that matter, it looks even worse than Akron on those days." The dwarf threw his axe to the ground and put his hands on his hips. "I can't make myself invisible," he snorted, "but at least I'm no fool. Go ahead, pick up the vicious little thing, give it a drink, pat its head, then you'll see what happens. As soon as it's got enough strength, the first thing it'll do is slice you to bits, and the next thing, fly straight to Oron. Then we'll be in a fine stew." "What Dolly says is true," Fluter added. "I myself don't enjoy chopping the things up. The bird is interesting in a disagreeable sort of way. But we've been lucky so far, with no trouble from Gwythaints at least. I don't see the use of bringing one of Auron's spies right into our bosom, as you might say. A Flam is always kind-hearted, but it seems to me this is overdoing it." "Medwin would not say so," Terran answered. "In the hills he spoke of kindness for all creatures, and he told me much about the Gwythaints. I think it's important to bring this one to Cardathel. No one has ever captured a live Gwythaint, as far as I know. What can tell what value it may have?" The bard scratched his head. "Well, yes, I suppose if it had any use at all, it would be better alive than dead, but the proposition is risky, no matter what." Terran gestured for the others to stand away from the bush. He saw the Gwythaint was wounded by more than thorns. Perhaps an eagle had challenged it, for it bled, flecked its back, and a number of feathers had been torn out. He reached in carefully. The Gwythaint hissed again, and a long, rasping rattle sounded in his throat. Terran feared the bird might be dying even then. He put a hand under its feverish body. The Gwythaint struck with beak and talons, but its strength had gone. Terran lifted it free of the thorn bush. "If I can find the right herbs, I'll make a poultice," Terran told Eloise, "but I'll need hot water to steep them." While the girl prepared a net of grass and leaves, Terran asked Gurgi to build a fire and heat some stones, which could be dropped into a cup of water. Then, with Hen Wen at his heels, he quickly set out to search for the plants. "How long are we going to stay here?" Dolly shouted after him. "Not that I care. You're the ones in a hurry, not I." "Humph." He thrust his axe into his belt and jammed his cap tight on his head, and furiously held his breath. Terran was again grateful for what Call had taught him of herbs. He found most of what he needed growing nearby. Hen Wen joined the hunt with enthusiasm, grunting happily, rooting under leaves and stones. Indeed, the white pig was the first to discover an important variety Terran had overlooked. The Gwythaint did not struggle when Terran applied the poultice. Spreading a piece of cloth torn from his jacket in another healing brew, he squeezed the liquid drop by drop into the bird's beak. "That's all very well," said Dolly, whose curiosity had got the better of him, and who had come to observe the operation. "How do you imagine you'll carry the nasty thing? Perched on your shoulder?" "I don't know," Terran said. "I thought I could wrap it in my cloak." Dolly snorted. That's the trouble with you great clodhoppers. You don't see beyond your noses. But if you expect me to build a cage for you, you're mistaken.
A cage would be just the thing, Taryn agreed.
No, I wouldn't want to bother you for that. I'll try to make one myself. The dwarf watched contemptuously while Taryn gathered saplings and attempted to weave them together. Oh, stop it, Dolly finally burst out. I can't stand looking at botched work. Here, get out of the way. He shouldered Taryn aside, squatted on the ground, and picked up the saplings. He trimmed them expertly with his knife, lashed them with braided vines, and in no time at all the dwarf held up a serviceable cage.
That's certainly more practical than making yourself invisible, Ellenby said.
The dwarf made no answer and only looked at her angrily. Taryn lined the bottom of the cage with leaves, gently put the Gwythaint inside, and they resumed their march. Dolly now led them at a faster pace to make up for the time they had lost. He tramped steadily down the hill slopes, without even turning to see whether Taryn and the others were able to keep up with him. The speed of their pace, Taryn realized, served little purpose, since they were obliged to halt more frequently. But he did not deem it wise to mention this to the dwarf. Throughout the day, the Gwythaint steadily improved. At each halt, Taryn fed the bird and applied the medicines. Gurgi was still too terrified to come near. Taryn alone dared handle the creature. When Fluter, endeavoring to make friends, put his fingers into the cage, the Gwythaint roused and slashed at him with his beak. I warn you, snapped Dolly. No good will come of this. But don't pay any attention to what I say. Go right ahead. Cut your own throats. Then come running and complaining afterwards. I'm just a guide. I do what I'm ordered to, and that's all. At nightfall, they made camp and discussed plans for the morrow. The Gwythaint had entirely recovered, and had also developed an enormous appetite. It squawked furiously when Taryn did not bring its food quickly enough, and rattled its beak against the cage. It gobbled up the morsels Taryn gave it, then looked around for more. After eating, the Gwythaint crouched at the bottom of the cage, its head cocked and listening, its eyes following every movement. Taryn finally ventured to put a finger near past the bars and scratch the Gwythaint's head. The creature no longer hissed, and it made no attempt to bite him. The Gwythaint even allowed Ellenby to feed it, but the bard's attempts to make friends failed again.
It knows perfectly well that you've agreed to chop off its head, Ellenby told Fluter, so you can't blame the poor thing for being annoyed at you. If somebody wanted to chop off my head, then come around afterward and want to be sociable, I'd peck at them too. Gwydion told me the birds are trained when young, Taryn said. I wish you were here. He would know best how to handle the creature. Perhaps it could be taught differently. Now there's bound to be a good falconer at Cairdathel, and we'll see what we can do.
But the next morning, the cage was empty. Dolly, who had risen long before the others, was first to discover it. The furious dwarf thrust the cage under Taryn's nose. The sapling bars had been slashed to pieces by the Gwythaint's beak. And there you have it, cried Dolly. I told you so. Don't say I didn't warn you. The treacherous creature's halfway to Anuvan by now, after listening to every word we said. If Oron didn't know where we are, now he'll soon know. You've done well, oh, very well. Dolly snorted. Spare me from fools and assistant pig-keepers. Taryn could not hide his disappointment or fear. Fluter said nothing, but the bard's face was grim.
I've done the wrong thing again, as usual, Taryn said angrily. Dolly is right. There's no difference between a fool and an assistant pig-keeper. That's probably true, agreed Ellenby, whose remark did not cheer Taryn up. But, she went on, I can't stand people who say, I told you so. That's worse than somebody coming up and eating your dinner before you have a chance to sit down. Even so, she added, Dolly means well. He's not half as disagreeable as he pretends to be, and I'm sure he's worried about us. He's like a porcupine, all prickly on the outside, but very ticklish once you turn him over. If he'd only stop trying to make himself invisible, I think it should do a lot to improve his disposition.
There was no time for further regrets. Dolly set them at an even swifter pace. They still followed the hills along the Yestrad Valley, but at midday the dwarf turned west, and once more began to descend toward the plains. The sky had grown as thick and gray as lead. Violent gusts of wind whipped at their faces. The pale sun gave no warmth. Melangar neighed uneasily. Hen Wen, placid and agreeable until now, began to roll her eyes and mutter to herself. While the companions rested briefly, Dolly went ahead to scout the land. In a short time he was back again. He led them to the crest of a hill, motioned them to stay close to the ground, and pointed toward the Yestrad below. The plain was covered with warriors, on foot and on horseback. Black banners snapped in the wind. Even at this distance, Terran could hear the clank of weapons, the steady, heavy drumming of marching feet. At the head of the winding columns rode the Horned King. The giant figure towered above the men-at-arms who galloped behind him. The curving antlers rose like eager claws. As Terran watched, terrified but unable to turn away, the Horned King's head swung slowly in the direction of the heights. Terran pressed flat against the earth. Auron's champion, he was sure, could not see him. But it was only a trick of his mind, a mirror of his own fear. For it seemed the Horned King's eyes sought him out and thrust like daggers at his heart. "They have overtaken us," Terran said in a flat voice.
"Hurry," snapped the dwarf. "Get hustling instead of dawdling and moaning. We're no more than a day away from Cardathel, and so are they. We can still move faster. If you hadn't stopped for that ungrateful spy of a Nuvan, we'd be well ahead of them by now. Don't say I didn't warn you."
"We should arm ourselves a little better," the bard said. "The Horned King will have outriders on both sides of the valley." Terran unstrapped the weapons on Melangar's back and handed a bow and quiver of arrows to his companions, as well as a short spear for each. King Idleleg had given them round, bronze bucklers. They were dwarf size, and, after his view of the marching hosts, Terran found them pitifully small. Gurgi buckled a short sword around his waist. Of all the band, he was the most excited. "Yes, yes," he cried. "Now bold, valiant Gurgi is a mighty warrior too. He has a grinding gasher and a pointed piercer. He is ready for great fightings and smitings." "And so am I," Fluter declared. "Nothing withstands the onslaught of an angry flam." The dwarf clapped his hands to his head and gnashed his teeth.
"Stop jabbering and move,"
he sputtered. This time he was too furious to hold his breath. Terran slung the buckler over his shoulder. Hen Wen hung back and grunted fearfully. "I know you're afraid," Terran whispered coaxingly, "but you'll be safe in Cardathel." The pig followed reluctantly, but as Dolly set off once again, she lagged behind, and it was all Terran could do to urge her forward. Her pink snout trembled, her eyes darted from one side of the path to the other. At the next halt, Dolly summoned Terran.
"Keep on like this," he cried, "and you'll have no chance at all. First a Gwythaint delays us, now a pig."
"She's frightened," Terran tried to explain to the angry dwarf. She knows the Horned King is near."
"Then tie her up. Put her on the horse."
Terran nodded. "Yes, she won't like it, but there's nothing else we can do." A few moments before, the pig had been crouched at the roots of a tree. Now there was no sign of her. "Hen?" Terran called. He turned to the bard. "Where did she go?" he asked in alarm. The bard shook his head. Neither he nor Elenwy had seen her move. Gurgi had been watering Melangar, and had not noticed the pig at all. "She can't have run off again," Terran cried. He raced back into the woods. When he returned, his face was pale. "She's gone," he gasped. "She's hiding somewhere, I know it." He sank to the ground and put his head in his hands. "I shouldn't have let her out of my sight, not even for a moment," he said bitterly. "I have failed twice." "Let the others go on," Elenwy said. "We'll find her and catch up with them." Before Terran could answer, he heard a sound that chilled his blood. From the hills came the voices of a hunting pack, in full cry, and the long notes of a horn. The companion stood frozen with dread. With the ice of terror in his throat, Terran looked at the silent faces around him. The dire music trembled in the air. A shadow flickered across the lowering sky. "Where Gwyn the Hunter rides," murmured Fluter, "Death rides close behind." Chapter 18. The Flame of Durnwen. No sooner had the notes of Gwyn's horns sunk into the hills than Terran started, as though waking from a fearful dream. Hoofbeats drummed across the meadow. "The Horned King's scouts!" cried Fluter, pointing to the mounted warriors galloping toward them. "They've seen us!" Up from the plains the riders sped, bent over their saddles, urging on their steeds. They drew closer, lances leveled, as each gleaming point sought its own target. "I could try to make another web," Elenwy suggested, then added, "but I'm afraid the last one wasn't too useful." Terran's sword flashed out. "There are only 4 of them," he said. "We matched them in numbers, at least." "Put up your blade," Fluter said. "Arrows first. We'll have work enough for swords later." They unslung their bows. Under Fluter's orders they formed a line and knelt shoulder to shoulder. The bard's spiky yellow hair blew in the wind. His face shone with excitement. "I haven't had a good fight in years," he said. "That's one of the things I miss being a bard. They'll see what it means to attack a flam. Taran knocked an arrow to the string. At a word from the bard, the companions drew their bows and took aim. Loose! shouted the bard. Taran saw his own shaft fly wide of the leading horseman. With a cry of anger, he seized another arrow from the quiver. Beside him, he heard Gurgi shout triumphantly. Of the volley, only Gurgi's bolt had found its mark. A warrior toppled from his horse, the shaft deep in his throat. They know we can sting, Fluter cried. Loose again! The horsemen veered, more cautious now. The warriors raised their bucklers. Of the three, two drove directly for the companions. The third turned his mount's head and galloped to the flank of the defenders. Now, friends, shouted the bard, back to back! Taran heard dully grunt as the dwarf loosed an arrow at the nearest warrior. Gurgi's shot had been lucky. Now the shots hissed through the air only to glance off the attackers' light shields. Behind Taran, Melangar whinnied and pawed the ground frantically. Taran remembered how valiantly she had fought for Gwydion, but she was tethered now, and he dared not break away from the defenders to untie her. The horsemen circled. One turned his exposed side to the companions. Dolly's arrow leaped from the bowstring and buried itself in the warrior's neck. The other horsemen spun their mounts and galloped across the meadow. We've beaten them, cried Elomy. That's like bees driving away eagles. The panting Fluter shook his head. They'll spend no more men on us. When they come back, they'll come with a warband. That's highly complimentary to our bravery, but I don't think we should wait for them. A flam knows when to fight and when to run. At this point, we had better run. I won't leave Hen Wen, cried Taran. Go look for her then, growled Dolly. You'll lose your head as well as your pig. Crafty Gurgi will go, suggested Gurgi, with bold seekings and peekings. In all likelihood, said the bard, they'll attack us again. We can't afford to lose what little strength we have. A fluter flam never worries about being outnumbered, but one sword less could be fatal. I am sure your pig is able to look out for herself. Wherever she may be, she is in less danger than we are. At least, she won't have a warband after her. Taran nodded. It is true, but it grieves me to lose her for the second time. I had chosen to abandon my search and go to Cairdathel. Then after Gurgi found Hen Wen, I had hoped to accomplish both tasks. But I fear I must be one or the other. The question is, said Fluter, is there any chance at all of warning the Sons of Dawn before the Horned King attacks? Dolly is the only one who can answer that. The dwarf scowled and thought for a moment. Possible, he said, but we'll have to go into the valley, and we'll be in the middle of the Horned King's vanguard if we do. Can we get through? asked Taran. Won't know until you've tried, grunted Dolly. The decision is yours, said the bard, glancing at Taran. We shall try, Taran answered. For the rest of the day they traveled without a halt. At nightfall, Taran would have been glad to rest, but the dwarf warned against it. The companions pressed on in weary silence. They had escaped the attack Fluter expected, but a column of horsemen bearing torches passed within bowshot of them. The companions crouched in the fringe of trees until the streaks of flame wound behind a hill and vanished. In a short time, Dolly led the little warband into the valley, where they found concealment in the wooded groves. But the dawn revealed a sight that filled Taran with despair. The valley roiled with warriors wherever he turned his eyes. Black banners whipped against the sky, and the host of the Horned King was like the body of an armed giant, restlessly stirring. For a moment, Taran stared in disbelief. He turned his face away. Too late, he murmured. Too late, we have failed. While the dwarf surveyed the marching column, Fluter strode ahead. There is one thing we can do, he cried. Cairdathel lies straight ahead. Let us go on and make our last stand there. Taran nodded. Yes, my place is at the side of Gwydion's people. Dolly shall lead Gurgi and Elomy to safety. He took a deep breath and buckled his sword more tightly. You have guided us well, he said quietly to the dwarf. Return to your king with our gratitude. Your work is done. The dwarf looked at him, furious. Done, he snorted. Idiots and numbskulls. It's not that I care what happens to you, but don't think I'm going to watch you get hacked to pieces. I can't stand a botched job. Like it or not, I'm going with you. Before the words were out of his mouth, an arrow sang past Dolly's head. Melangar reared up. A party of foot soldiers sprang from the woods behind the companions. Begone! The bard shouted to Taran. Ride as fast as you can, or it will be the death of us all. When Taran hesitated, the bard seized him by the shoulders, pitched him towards the horse, and thrust Elomy after him. Fluter drew his sword. Do as I say, shouted the bard, his eyes blazing. Taran leaped to Melangar's saddle and pulled Elenwy up behind him. The white horse shot forward. Elenwy clung to Taran's waist as the steed galloped straight across the bracken toward the vanguard of the Horned King. Taran made no attempt to guide her. The horse had chosen her own path. Suddenly, he was in the midst of the warriors. Melangar reared and plunged. Taran's sword was out and he struck right and left. A hand clutched at the stirrups, then was ripped away. Taran saw the warriors stumble back and down in the press of struggling men. The white horse broke free and streaked for the brow of the hill. One mounted figure galloped behind them now. In a terrified glance, Taran saw the sweeping antlers of the Horned King. The black steed gained on them. Melangar turned sharply and drove towards the forest. The Horned King turned with her, and as they crashed through the underbrush and past the first row of trees, the antlered giant drew closer until both steeds galloped side by side. In a final burst of speed, the horse of the Horned King plunged ahead. The animal's flanks bore against Melangar, who reared furiously and struck out with her hoofs. Taran and Elenwy were flung from the saddle. The Horned King turned his mount, seeking to trample them. Taran scrambled to his feet and struck blindly with his sword. Then, gripping Elenwy's arm, he pulled her deeper into the protection of the trees. The Horned King sprang heavily to the ground and was upon them in a few long strides. Elenwy screamed. Taran swung about to face the antlered man. Dark fears clutched Taran, as though the Lord of Anuvan himself had opened an abyss at his feet, and he was hurtling downward. He gasped with pain as though his old wound had opened up once again. All the despair he had known as Akron's captive returned to sap his strength. Behind the bleached skull, the eyes of the Horned King flamed as he raised a crimson-stained arm. Blindly, Taran brought up his sword. It trembled in his hand. The Horned King's blade lashed against the weapon and shattered it with a single blow. Taran dropped the useless shards. The Horned King paused. A growl of savage joy rose in his throat, and he took a firmer grasp on his weapon. Mortal terror goaded Taran into action. He leaped back and spun toward Elenwy. "Dernwyn!" he cried. "Give me the sword!" Before she could move, he tore belt and weapon from her shoulder. The Horned King saw the black scabbard and hesitated a moment, as if in fear. Taran grasped the hilt. The blade would not come free. He pulled with all his strength. The sword moved only a little from its sheath. The Horned King raised his own weapon. As Taran gave a final wrench, the scabbard turned in his hand. A blinding flash split the air in front of him. Lightning seared his arm, and he was thrown violently to the ground. The sword Dernwyn, blazing white with flame, leaped from his hand and fell beyond his reach. The Horned King stood over him. With a cry, Elenwy sprang at the antlered man. Snarling, the giant tossed her aside. A voice rang out behind the Horned King. Through eyes blurred with pain, Taran glimpsed a tall figure against the trees, and heard a shouted word he could not distinguish. The Horned King stood motionless, his arm upraised. Lightning played about his sword. The giant flamed like a burning tree. The staghorns turned to crimson streaks. The skull mask ran like molten iron. A roar of pain and rage rose from the antlered king's throat. With a cry, Taran flung an arm across his face. The ground rumbled and seemed to open beneath him. Then there was nothing. This concludes Chapter 18 of Taran's Adventures. Thank you for listening, and remember, have a good day. You deserve it.